Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No Longer Enslaved, where we have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. In this episode, I am going to be addressing the Nephilim Mind Virus. How have parasites been weaponized? How do they hijack our minds? And how can we break free from this mind control? So I'm excited you're joining us, and we're going to dig into some disgusting stuff. I'm not going to lie. But I promise to bring us to a place of hope by the end. So if you can hang in there with me, it might be rough for a little bit, but I promise, once again, we are going to end with some hope and empower you on how to fight against mind control. So I have to say, as I wrote The Roots of the Federal Reserve and the Lord had me coin the term Nephilim host, I was not thinking about parasites at all. In fact, it wasn't until a couple of years ago, I think it was the beginning of 2023, maybe the end of 2022, when the Lord just nudged me to begin studying parasites. Well, I have to say that is not for the faint of heart. I don't recommend doing research on parasites when you're eating. I made that mistake. It was disgusting. In fact, I nearly vomited. And, the rabbit holes that I went down that I felt like the Lord was leading me to investigate, it was so gross. I nearly quit. I nearly gave up on the research. But once I discovered that, these parasites can control our minds, I was like, game on. And there's no way that these small little bugs are going to hide in the shadows any longer. So I am applying Ephesians 5:11 when it comes to parasites. So buckle up and let's dig in. Now, it turns out that 60 million Americans are infected with parasites, and it causes an array of diseases. So let me first start by defining what a parasite is, because there's biological parasites and then there's societal parasites. So with a biological parasite, it's a living organism that feeds on another larger living organism, often called a host. And the parasite will feed on that living organism to draw nutrients from it so it can grow and multiply. Now, most often, that growth and multiplication harms the host. So that's what a biological parasite is. A societal parasite is somebody who feeds off of, depends upon, or exploits another person without giving anything in return. Well, you know me, I love to dig into the etymology of words. And so if we look at, the meaning of parasite and worm in the Greek and the Hebrew, it begins to connect some dots that I think were very interesting when I discovered these. So to start with, a Greek term for parasite is parasitos, and it means a person who eats at another's table. Now, one of the Hebrew words for worm, there's many, but one of them is tolah, and it means scarlet, worm, crimson, and maggot. Now, immediately when I discovered this, I was intrigued because my radar with the color red being part of the calling card of the Nephilim agenda was going off, reading that, okay, why is part of the meaning of worm scarlet and crimson? Well, in previous videos, I've talked quite a bit about the calling card of the Nephilim agenda. Well, red, along with the circumpunct, which is the circle with a dot, those were two symbols that I traced all throughout history that unveiled the Nephilim agenda. And this is what helped me trace the Nephilim from the days of Noah to our current day. Well, what's interesting is, without going into a lot of detail, both of this is in my books, or both books. But when you think about red being connected to the Nephilim agenda, the origin point of that, from what I discovered, is with Esau. When Esau changed and became Edom. Now, the Hebrew word for Edom is Adam, and it means to be red. Well, my naturally inquisitive mind is like, what the heck does it mean to be red? And so I began digging in. Well, what's interesting is, so Esau, he traded his birthright for red lentil stew. And we see this in Genesis 25. Well, the backstory of what was going on prior to that can be found in the extra biblical text of the book of Jasher. Well, Esau was out on the hunting fields, and he hunted down Nimrod and killed Nimrod and two of his men. So Esau was on the run from the rest of Nimrod's men when he runs into the tent and he finds Jacob making the red lentil stew. Now, as a side note, the red lentil stew was the traditional meal of comfort that the eldest son would make for the grieving father. And that's, Isaac was grieving the death of Abraham. So Esau should have been the one in the tent, being the eldest son. He should have been the one making the red lentil stew. But instead, he's off in the fields killing others because he's bloodthirsty. Well, that was the origin or the genesis of the color red being a calling card for the Nephilim agenda. So then here, when we look at the Hebrew word for worm, meaning scarlet worm, crimson, and maggot, it's yet another example of the color red being connected to the Nephilim agenda. And I'll explain more in just a minute. Now, when we look at the Hebrew root word for worm or tola, it's yala. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it means to speak rashly, to talk wildly, to blurt out inconsiderably, and to devour. Well, you think about this, and this definition actually more accurately describes Nephilim hosts more than worms. And interestingly, 12 of the 19 behavioral characteristics that I identified for the Nephilim and their giant offspring, these have parasitic behaviors. It's parasitic in nature. And so I'll read these 12, and you can begin to see how the dots connect. Now as I read these, think of my definition for a societal parasite, one that exploits others for their own personal gain. So here are some of the characteristics of a Nephilim host. Lustfulness in conjunction with sexual misconduct. A pervasive pattern of instability in relationships marked by control, manipulation, intimidation, and domination over others. Haughty and prideful, as if above reproach. Vengeful or inappropriate, intense anger. Reoccurring violent acts displaying the disregard for the rights of others. A lack of remorse for heinous acts against other living things. Dishonesty in trade and in business transactions, a propensity toward corruption. Sexual perversion involving pedophilia, sexual domination of others against their will, and or bestiality. Trafficker of humans, engage in cannibalism, commit human sacrifices, and the enslavement of others. So as you can see, many of these behavioral characteristics are consistent with a societal parasite, one who exploits others for their own personal gain. We also think about, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is parasitic in nature because it feeds on the debt of we the people. So let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit deeper. At the core of the Nephilim agenda is this goal to strip us of our humanity. They want to hijack our bodies and turn us into hybrids. Well, in order to do that, they have to hijack our minds first. And it turns out that biological parasites are capable of mind control. This is yet another way the Nephilim agenda is advancing. So how do parasites hijack our mind? Well, thanks to the growing field of neuroparasitology, which examines the impact that parasites have on our central nervous system, we now know that parasites can alter the behavior of their host because what they do is they hijack the decision-making process. See, parasites are masters at chemical and biological warfare. They specialize in mind control and molecular mimicry. So what parasites do is they can influence a host on multiple levels, from societal levels all the way down to our DNA. And because what they do, these parasites disrupt the perception of reality and control the behavior of their hosts. Now, I want to give you some examples. We're going to look at Toxoplasma gondii, or T. gondii. And this is a parasite that's found in cat feces and undercooked meat. Now, 30% of the world's population is infected with T. gondii. 22% of the US population is infected. And T. gondii can remain, in our bodies and lay dormant for several years. Well, T. gondii prefers to invade the lymph nodes, the brain, the heart, and the lungs. And it manipulates the behavior of its host by using epigenetic processes to alter genes within the amygdala. And this is fascinating to me. So stimuli that normally activate a fear response actually activate sexual arousal instead, and that leads to fatal attraction phenomenon. So the host will become less risk aversive. And let me give you an example. So for an infected mouse, as an example, with T. gondii, the mouse will find cat urine sexually arousing. And so they will be drawn to the cat rather than have a typical feared response. And this often proves fatal. Well, for infected humans, risky situations are actually seen as benign situations. In fact, infected people have an increased attraction to harmful sexual deviant practices. And I'll give you some examples with that. Women who are infected with T. gondii have reported engaging in bestiality more frequently than non-infected women. This is also a behavioral characteristic of Nephilim host, if you remember what I just read of the 12 characteristics. Well, men who are infected with T. gondii, they report engaging in sexual practices such as bondage, rape, and violence. These are also behavioral characteristics of Nephilim hosts. Well, T. gondii is also correlated with certain neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. Also, mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In fact, 1/5 of all the cases of schizophrenia can be attributed to parasites. Now, if I would have known that when I was practicing, because early in my clinical practice, I worked with people battling schizophrenia. If I would have known this, I would have had my clients do a parasite cleanse under the guidance of, either a functional integrative medicine doctor or a naturopath, because I would want to understand how much are these parasites, which are mind-altering organisms, afflicting the person and causing mental illness. I think that would be really important to understand as a clinician. Well, the other thing to keep in mind is Toxoplasma gondii causes significantly higher risk of suicide. Well, not only does it affect us personally, but there's been some research of how Toxoplasma gondii in a population can actually impact their culture. So there's a professor from the University of California in Santa Barbara. His name is Kevin Lafferty, and he did some research looking at higher prevalence rates in populations of T. gondii. And what he found is that those with higher prevalence rates exhibited more neuroticism. Now, neuroticism is a personality trait disposition that a person has, a lot more negative affect than your average person. So you're going to see things like anger, anxiety, irritability, depression, self-consciousness, just this general overall emotional instability. Well, that affects the culture, and it can lead to authoritarian type governments, which is fascinating to me. The other thing that was very interesting in the research that I did is I discovered that there is a correlation, or parasites could be associated, that's a better way of saying it, with homosexuality. So back in the 1980s, 2 different research studies, I think separated by about 3 years' time, 2 different research groups, they found almost the same findings. And that is that there was a 400% increase in the prevalence rate of intestinal parasites within homosexual men as compared to heterosexual men. And I've also read numerous anecdotal reports that gay men report a drop in their craving for anal sex after having a parasite cleanse. So I think a lot more further research is needed in this area. I mean, it would be groundbreaking research, but of course it probably wouldn't receive any funding. And that even if it did get funding, most likely the findings would not be published because, of course, it goes against the narrative right now. And that is concerning. So it's interesting in that I think this explains why there hasn't been any updated research on the association between parasites and homosexuality in the last 35 years. Another very interesting thing that ties into being a Nephilim host is that parasites, there was a study in 2015 linking parasites with cannibalism. So researchers found that freshwater shrimp with a common parasite known as Pleistophorum muleri, they had an increased rate of cannibalism as compared to non-infected shrimp. So in other words, the parasite in these shrimp caused them to become efficient foragers of young shrimp. Now, again, my naturally inquisitive mind is like, okay, could this impact humans in a similar way? And is that why we're seeing a rise in people talking about cannibalism? And again, cannibalism is one of the traits of Nephilim hosts. So I want to give you some kind of current examples of how parasites have been weaponized against us. Now, again, Nephilim hosts, they are advancing the Nephilim agenda, and one way they're doing that is by weaponizing parasites as a form of biowarfare. So I have a good friend, Mitchell Florin. He was a biopharmaceutical microbiologist. He was a whistleblower on Big Pharma. You may have heard me talk about him before. And he's helped me understand how to connect some of these dots. So first of all, one of the things that is important to understand is that all pathogens are parasitic in nature, but not all parasites are pathogens. So parasites need a living host to survive. So technically speaking, viruses are parasitic in nature. And he says this, he says, viruses are small obligate intracellular parasites, which by definition contains either an RNA or DNA genome surrounded by a protective virus-coated protein coat. Well, he talked about how Lyme disease has been unleashed as a bioweapon. And Mitchell describes Lyme disease as an obligately parasitic, tick-transmitted, invasive, persistent bacterial pathogen that causes disease in humans and non-reservoir vertebrates, primarily through the induction of inflammation. So in the 1950s, ticks were weaponized with the help of Nazi scientists from Project Paperclip in conjunction with Fort Detrick, which is the offshore germ warfare animal disease lab on Plum Island. So then about 20 years later, you have this outbreak of a strange disease in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And that's where Lyme disease gets its name from. Well, a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi is carried by ticks, and it's the cause of Lyme disease. And it attacks the central nervous system of humans, causing these debilitating symptoms. Another more recent example of weaponization of parasites is found in the C19 poke. So Dr. Robert Young found the trypanosoma parasite in the Pfizer jab. And this parasite can be lethal because it causes inflammation in the heart and also the neural membranes. Well, strains of this parasite can actually cause a fatal sleeping sickness in Africa. North American strains can cause what's called Chagas disease, which is also fatal. And so there seems to be also a higher prevalence of trypanosoma in AIDS patients. So why on earth is Pfizer putting this in the jab? And it makes me wonder, is this what has led to sudden adult death syndrome? Then in December of 2021, scientists unveiled this advancement in biotechnology in the first ever self-replicating robots called xenobots. Now, these robots originated from stem cells from frog legs, and they can collect nearby cells to replicate themselves. So these xenobots can be made into parasites, viruses, or bacteria because they're non-differentiated. Well, what this means is that scientists can create synthetic organisms that self-replicate indefinitely. Okay, Now, what could go wrong with that invention, right? Well, in a moment of dystopian confession, the inventor, founder of nanotechnology, his name is Eric Drexler, he tells us what could go wrong. And he writes in his book, The Engines of Creation, he writes about the potential of gray goo. So he envisioned this time when nanobots would replicate incessantly and devour the biosphere, transforming everything into this gray goo, which is this sludge that is part of themselves, and they leave that behind. Well, we can see that scientists are rapidly progressing towards this precipice. Not only that, but scientists have found a way to manipulate memory through using optogenetics. Now, optogenetics is one of the emerging mind control technologies that allows for the manipulation of memories. So really, the 21st century is the era of memory engineering, and this has a profound impact. You think about Aristotle. He once said that memory is the scribe of the soul. Well, that's because our memories make up the narrative of our lives. They shape who we are. We learn from our past experiences. So to manipulate memory is really to manipulate life. So let's look at what is optogenetics. Well, it's a neurobiological technique that combines light with genetic engineering to control a genetically modified neurons. So neurons, you can think of these as cells that are in our brain and our nervous system. And we can think of them as like living storage containers that have these doorways called ion channels. So if the neuron receives a strong enough signal, what it does is it opens the door, and that allows an electrical current to flow through and to branch out to other neighboring neurons. And this is how, information gets transmitted throughout our brain cells. Well, optogenetics hijacks this process. So optogenetics is a form of gene therapy. And what scientists have done is they redesign a neuron to be sensitive to light by changing the information in the genetic code of a lab animal. So essentially what scientists do is they add genetic code to specific neurons that they want to control. And this new code creates a special protein called an opsin, which is sensitive to light. And the neurons are then bombarded with light so that the scientists can particularly select and activate and deactivate the neurons that they want to control. Now, research in this area first began in the 1970s, but seminal breakthroughs came in the early 2000s. And today it's the most rapidly growing field of applied research. Now, one of the seminal breakthroughs was when scientists discovered that the opsin produced by green algae is activated by blue light. So the ion channel within green algae is called channel rhodopsin 2 or CHR2, and it's responsible for the algae growing towards the light. The algae grows at the top of the lake because it's going towards the light. Well, what scientists thought is that if they can mimic this process by creating neurons that express light sensitivity in ion channels like CHR2, then they could potentially control the activation of these neurons using bursts of light. So scientists began to genetically alter lab animals by placing the genes which encode for CHR2 within viruses. And then they infect the lab animal with that virus that holds the CHR2 gene. And when it gets into the neurons, then the neurons become light sensitive. Well, then from there, scientists implant optical fibers within the brains of animals so that they can control the neurons with a pulse of LED blue light. So essentially, optogenetics allows scientists to track brain activity because the genetically modified neurons light up when they're activated. And I want to share a couple of studies that will help us kind of understand this better. So in 2014, there was a study published in Nature, and it shows us how optogenetics can be used. Now, as a side note, what's interesting is the researchers, Nabavi et al., they are from UC San Diego, which is my alma mater for my undergraduate studies. And when I was in undergraduate work, I was doing research in a pigeon lab using operant conditioning to train the behaviors of a pigeon. Well, Nabavi and his researchers, they also used operant conditioning. They wanted to use those techniques to activate and deactivate conditioned feared response within rats. So what they did is they paired an audible tone with a shock. And that conditioned the rat to associate the tone with a shock. And this forms, an associated memory of a feared response. And this is classic behavioral modification. But the twist in Nabavi's study is that they injected a virus containing the CHR2 gene into the amygdala of rats, because the amygdala is where fear originates from. And instead of pairing a shock with an auditory tone, they paired it with a burst of light. And so it created a feared response similar to the auditory tone. Well, then the researchers discovered that they were able to deactivate the memory of the feared response by altering the pattern of the pulsating lights. They also discovered they could reactivate the memory of the feared response by using light to generate activity in the amygdala. So the bottom line is these scientists discovered how to manipulate memory. And that's why I say, we are living in an era of memory engineering. Now, another study, this one was published in Science, and the title of it was called Creating a False Memory in the Hippocampus. And it outlines how MIT scientists were able to create false memories in genetically modified mice. So what they did is they injected the mice with the CHR2 gene to shape memory. And the neurons activated in the process of memory formation. They light up because of the CHR2 being in the neurons. And that allowed scientists to be able to know exactly which neurons to manipulate. Well, then they were able to successfully make mice recall something that did not happen. So let me explain. They took mice and they put the mice in Arena A. And this was like a maze. And so they gave the mice free range to run around and discover this new arena. Meanwhile, they're tracking the neurons that are activated in the memory formation of Arena A. Then they take those mice out and they put them in Arena B. And they trigger the memory of Arena A and they pair that with electric shock. Then they take the mice out of Arena B, put them back in Arena A, and the mice showed a marked feared response. And so they had a memory of being shocked in Arena A, even though they never received shock in Arena A. Well, for the scientists to prove that this was because they were able to successfully manipulate memory, they took the mice out of Arena A, put them in Arena C, which was a novel arena, new situation, never been in it, and the mice did not form a feared response. And so this shows how they were able to successfully manipulate the memory of the mice in Arena A and drawing up that feared response. Well, now, one of the things we have to consider is what if they start using this on humans? And my friend Mitchell Florin would suggest that they already are, because the science that we know that are in our scientific journals, that are available to the public, conservatively, that's 50 to 60 years behind what clandestine military operations are using and the occult is using. So most likely they already are using light to manipulate memories. Now this raises all sorts of profound ethical concerns. Do we want to erase memory in people? Proponents of it would certainly argue that the benefits is we could erase traumatic memories. You could cure PTSD as an example. Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, do we want to eliminate suffering from our lives? Some people would say yes. Why would you want to hold on to suffering on this side of heaven? Well, when we suffer, it actually brings us into proximity with Jesus. There's a certain sacredness to suffering because we see aspects of Jesus' character that we can't see any other way. And so I would argue, do we want to, remove suffering and not be able to be in the presence of God in such a beautiful way that only comes through that suffering. At the core of the Nephilim agenda is the goal to strip us of our humanity. And in order for Nephilim hosts to do that, in order for them to hijack our bodies and turn us into hybrids, they have to hijack our mind first. But the good news is they cannot hijack the mind of Christ, which is why it is crucial that we take every thought captive. And the good news is that Jesus already has the path for our freedom marked out for us. And we cannot lose sight of the fact that he is our living hope. It means that we are never without hope. Hope never dies. And that is such tremendous news. And I don't raise concerns, about optogenetics, self-replicating robots, about parasites to stir up fear in people. I'm doing it because the Lord has asked me to walk in Ephesians 5:11. And if you think about Hosea 4:6, it says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. So we have to know the kind of fight that we're in, the battle that is raging all around us. We don't want to be ignorant of it. But we also have to remember 2 Timothy 1:7, which says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Now, we are triune beings, which means we're made up of body, soul, and spirit. And so the enemy, this Nephilim agenda, is attacking us on all three levels. So we have to learn how to fight on all three levels. And one way that we can combat parasites, on the level of our body is by doing a parasite cleanse. Those of you that have been outside of the United States, whether that's Mexico, South America, the Caribbean, Indonesia, Africa, South America, you might have a parasite. You may have picked up parasites on your travels. If you have cats, if you enjoy sushi, you might have parasites. And so there's all sorts of parasite cleanses out there. In fact, Mitchell Florin has put together a protocol for a parasite cleanse. I have that in my article called Parasite Free in 23. I'll put a link of that in the description box. We don't make any money from it. It is just, we want to equip people to be able to do a parasite cleanse. But one of the things I have to make very clear, Mitchell made sure that I do this, is that if you have comorbidities, so if you have other ailments, mental illness, physical illness, and you're taking other medications, you will want to make sure you do a parasite cleanse under the guidance of either a naturopath or a functional integrative medicine doctor, because you could actually do yourself more harm than good by doing a parasite cleanse on your own if you're taking other medication, because there could be an interaction there. Also, if you go too fast with a parasite cleanse, you could just really wreak havoc for yourself. So it's important to go slow. And if you have comorbidities, to make sure you're working in conjunction with somebody that can oversee all your medical issues, mental health issues. But with that said, I want to encourage us to be proactive. Let's not give these mind-altering organisms free range in our bodies. Let's go after it. Get rid of the parasites. So that's what we can do on the level of the body. Now, as far as the soul and spirit, the Word of God equips us with so many tools, and I'll just mention a few. First of all, we want to think about renewing our mind. And I've talked about this many times. Romans 12:2, it's a go-to, it's a staple for me. It says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We don't want parasites to make decisions for us. We want our soul, our mind, will, and emotion surrendered to the Holy Spirit, surrendered to the purposes of Yahweh. We want to be able to walk in accordance to the things that Jesus has for us. So we have to renew our mind day by day. It's not like, sometimes maybe I'll get to it. 2 Corinthians 10:5 is a game changer. It says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. Well, I learned the importance of this just recently. I was on a trip. It was a wonderful trip, wonderful ministry trip. I was there 6 days, had all sorts of incredible interactions with people. But there was one day in particular that I got hit hard with witchcraft and sorcery, and it nearly knocked me off my feet. And I was like, Lord, what was that? Like, I've been in very dark places. I've been in Torino ministering. That's a witchcraft capital of the world. And I didn't get nearly knocked off my feet like I did here in this one circumstance. And so now what I do always, if I'm facing attack of some sort or anything, I'm like, okay, Lord, what is it in me? Where's the open door in me that is allowing me to be as affected by this witchcraft? And the Lord showed me that I didn't take a thought captive. I maybe entertained it for 2 minutes, 3 minutes is all, but I didn't take it captive. And that left an open door. And so when I came into this situation and was interacting with a particular person that is operating in witchcraft, probably unknowingly, it affected me so deeply because I did not take that thought captive. And so that's why I say it's a game changer. So we want to renew our mind day by day. We want to take those thoughts captive. We want to set our minds on things above. And the beautiful thing is, Jesus is our waymaker. He already has the path for your freedom marked out for you. All you have to do is ask him. The Holy Spirit loves to guide us in love and into all truth. And one of the things that I do is I put on my spiritual armor every day. And that's as a reminder that I am in spiritual battle day in, day out. Because we're in the seed war. It's the longest standing consecutive war of history. Jesus won the war through his life, death, and resurrection. But the battle still rages until the end of days when Jesus returns in all of his glory. And he puts an end once and for all to the longest standing war in history, the seed war. But until then, we cannot pretend that we're not in a battle. So anyways, I put on my armor every day. And I bind my mind to the mind of Christ because I want my thoughts to align with his thoughts. And this is one of the ways that we can battle against mind control. And remember, the name of Jesus is more powerful than any parasite that might be multiplying and living in our bodies. And his blood speaks a better word. And so we go back and, we think about Romans 8:31, which says, "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us?" So remember, we are more than conquerors, and we have Jesus as our strong tower who can cleanse us of parasites. So I want to encourage you, go after it. Go after doing a parasite cleanse. Renew your mind day by day. Surrender your spirit to the Holy Spirit so we are in proper alignment. And this is how we defeat the Nephilim agenda. Thanks for joining me.